Hi, I'm Reed. This is Crowline Publishing. Welcome back to part 3 of our deep dive into Lovecraftian horror. So, with all the stuff that we've talked about now, you need to create a dark fantasy Lovecraftian campaign. Now, there's a lot to get through, so we're going to go pretty quickly, but there's a few things that you're going to need to prepare. Adventure themes. You need PCs that have bought into the genre, which means creating appropriate characters. You're going to need interesting adventures, and that can be any regular kind of D&D adventure. It's just locations and mood. And you're going to need the correct kinds of antagonists, monsters, and NPCs. Let's get into it. Now, the themes of dark fantasy are themes common to most horror. Alienation, fear, disgust, terror, anger, hate, Jesus Christ, pain, hopelessness, predation. Honestly, saying it all like that doesn't sound like very much fun except to anyone who's already a horror fan. And horror fans are likely to be playing horror RPGs anyway. So if you're a DM who is looking to pitch a campaign, or even if you're a player who is asking for some changes to a campaign, you might be selling something that on paper does not sound very fun at all. So because this is mainly DM's job, we're going to talk to DMs. So you need to correctly pitch a dark fantasy campaign. I think that one of the best ways to do that is to point out that A, it is still heroic fantasy. You are probably going to win and beat the bad guys. It's just that the bad guys are going to be particularly bad. And it can be fun and even a cathartic experience to experience those themes and those ideas in a safe and mediated environment, like, for instance, an RPG group. And you should also be prepared to really demonstrate that it's fine to experience dark emotions because your game is going to be about conquering them. If you're playing D&D, you're going to be talking about conquering. So the primary themes of cosmic horror is that there are entities beyond us who wish to return to our world. Now they can be opposed, but in traditional cosmic horror they can't really be stopped. And sometimes this is noble. It's, you're clawing back one more second, one more night, one more year for humanity, and that's enough. And sometimes it's seen as pathetic and futile. You've set a clock back by a second. Talking to your players beforehand, letting them know that this is about ultimately victory and that you're setting the dial between hope and despair towards hope, it's much, much easier to pitch to players. We're going to do dark fantasy. So the adventure themes. Well, we've pretty much covered them in our previous videos. Really quickly, the past is always horrific. It was ruled over by these terrifying entities. People are corrupted by their contact with the supernatural or alien entities. Mutation, physical and spiritual, are a recurring motif of cosmic horror. And the idea is that the world was once theirs. Whoever they are, you need to decide who they are, and they want it back. Those are the key themes of what your dark fantasy Lovecraftian horror game should be. If you keep those things in mind, you can keep the aesthetic up and running. Alright, easy. Then you need interesting adventures, and specifically you need interesting locations. Now a lot of D&D is already in the field of cosmic and Lovecraftian horror anyway. You're already dealing with ancient threats from the past in horrible, out-of-the-way locations. So you want to tie in your locations with the themes. So if you need to go and consult a wizard, the wizard is not 1,000 years old. The wizard is alive since time immemorial. He was there in the days of Atlantis. He's seen kingdoms rise and fall 1,000 times. The castle that you're going through, you do some research, the bard does his lore roll, and the castle's always been there. There's no point in human history where it hasn't existed. If you're meeting a dragon, it's not 1,000 years old, it's 50,000 years old. It's eternal, it cannot die. If you're going into a cave, emphasize how deep the cave is, how dark it is, how it bores down into the bones of the earth. Try and remember details like cave paintings from ancient ancestors, signs of human habitation from back in the days when we were still running away from dinosaurs, that sort of thing. And you're looking for alien spaces. If you want to have players spending a few weeks clearing out a cult. That's always great. Have the cult lead down to an ancient alien city beneath the earth. Other locations, we've talked a few times now about locations, so I'll just go through real quick. But you want to read Shadow Out of Time for the city he finds in Australia. You want to read Junji Ito's masterpiece Spiral, those last few issues especially. You want to think about alien topographies. This is a recurring motif in the cosmic horror. Mathematics and geography and geometry are wrong. Something is corrupting them, or we are perceiving the world as it correctly is. Lovecraft himself, as we've talked about, was very interested in architecture, and so man-made buildings and locations become alien, terrifying. Something as simple as MC Escher drawings will inspire you. The painter Hogarth and his famous false perspectives. John Coulthardt's remarkable Call of Cthulhu comic adaptation and his version of Relier, Cthulhu's home city. There is something very disturbing when time breaks down and when right angles are not at 90 degrees. When you begin to feel very, very uncomfortable in spaces that don't make sense. Try and play that up. I would recommend a film like, it's a children's film, but Labyrinth. Have a look at some of the strange physical locations in Labyrinth. Mouth of Madness, one of my favorites. The church, evil church, events starts to break down in time and space there, so that you enter one room and then everything is different when you look back. It's very well done. Last Year at Marienbad is a fantastic film. Have a look at how it's edited to create dislocation in time and space. Check out some of the stranger locations on Earth. If you've ever seen any of the testing ranges for deep underwater diving, there's the strange terrains that they make up to put you into extreme conditions. I find it quite confronting to imagine being trapped in a place like that. Or the quietest place on Earth, a sound recording booth that is apparently so quiet you can hear your own heartbeat. I don't know why, that kind of creeps me out. And then there's the highlight of any dark fantasy Lovecraftian campaign, the other dimension. There's a few ways that you can think about it. It's a parasite universe that's somehow latched onto ours. It's a horrific timeline that won't die. It's the dream of an old one. Or it's the true reality, and ours is just a mistake that cosmically happened. They should not be hell. They should not be moral places. They should not be explicable in terms of human religion. This isn't heaven. This isn't hell. This is just somewhere else. Again, Bloodborne, I've talked about that a few times here because it's so amazing. Have a think about the dreams of the old ones. Warcraft has a whole other dimension that is just simply the dreams of an old god's ruling the world, and that itself is enough to create an entire alternative dimension where everything is tentacles and horror and darkness. Well done. The Upside Down from Stranger Things is a really good example of our world reflected through the dreams of Lovecraftian monsters. Lorule from Zelda is an interesting take. I really like The Outer Church from The Invisibles. It is Universe B, if you've ever read Kenneth Grant stuff. A hellish universe where the Archons toil and writhe in the coils of the macro geometry of the alien god Abaddon. I would also recommend that you actually go and have a look at Call of Cthulhu Adventures. Actually, CSC isn't going to work fantastically if you just rewrite them for D&D. They rarely, if ever, take into account violence and magic and things like that. And sometimes they rely on modern technology, especially the modern books. Call of Cthulhu Now was set in the modern times, or at least the 90s. I mean, you can always rework a mad biologist as a wizard, of course, but, you know. I've run Mask of Nyarlathotep as a space fantasy. They're not perfect for running in with more adventuring, violent kinds of campaigns like D&D is, but they're at least worth stealing the setup for the campaign from. And they're classics for a reason. Lamentations of the Flame Princess is specifically dark fantasy with a Lovecraftian bent, but I don't know. There's a lot of humorless, eye-rolling, splatterpunk nonsense in it. You know, like, you walk into this room and you wee yourself, and the wee is an elemental and it attacks you in the vagina and penis. Roll for wee elemental damage, like that. And they rarely play fair. It's a lot of rocks falls, everyone dies nonsense. But they are often quite atmospheric, and I think you get a lot of mileage out of taking something like Monolith Beyond Space and Time, cutting out all the nonsense, malarkey, and just having a good dark adventure. Warhammer Fantasy, that has some great campaigns, and of course you've always got the Chaos Gods there in the background. And Shadowrun, especially the stuff with the insect shamans. Surprisingly, you could get a lot of work out of a dungeon punk, Lovecraftian Shadowrun. Lots of stuff to steal from. But let's get to the good bits. Let's get to the monsters. Monsters are my favourite. Not just in RPGs, but in the world. Monsters are what I love. Monsters, and dealing with them, might be the whole point of D&D, and they need to be handled a little bit differently in cosmic horror. Now, a lot of the core assumptions of Lovecraft is that what is different from humanity is wrong, always. If it is intelligent and it has a non-human body, it is monstrous. It's that simple. But in heroic fantasy in D&D, you're encouraged to have empathy, to literally pretend to be what in Lovecraftian horror is an alien nightmare. But in D&D, when you see a human-fish hybrid, you very well might just be looking at the party cleric. And if you encounter a horrifying snake woman, well, that's just the party bard who has seduced the fishman, party cleric. So you need to remember monsters are alien. You really do need to remove familiarity if you can. So you need to remember that they're alien, which means you need to break with tradition, you need to break with the folkloric and the mythological. No hydras, chimeras, basilisks, cockatrice, griffins, pegasi, dragons. Or if you must use them, pseudonatural them up. A lot of D&D animals are just earth animals with a twist, gigantism, or a weird attack, or it's just two animals smudged together. Don't do that if you can. You want to break with the Gothic. It's a different kind of horror tradition that informs us, but we must be separate from. No vampires, no werewolves, no ghosts, or ghouls, or wights. Again, in cosmic horror, undeath is a universe-shattering, horrible curse. It's a big deal. So you don't want Dracula looking sexy as hell in his tuxedo chasing you around. You, however, might have an entity that once was human and is now cursed with an endless black hole for a heart, who longs for the vitality of the universe and finds it in human spittle or something, make it gross. And here's for a bit of extra fun. You can get too Lovecraftian. Lovecraftian's greatest monsters are things like universe-sized time gods, demon monsters that the universe literally revolves around. Probably the best expression of the Lovecraftian vision is the color out of space. It's a color. It's not a spectral entity. It's not a weird gas. It's a color. Pathfinder, D&D's sister game, gave the living colors a stats, and it completely failed to capture what's interesting about it. So you need to be careful when you're picking all these monsters. I would recommend you have a look through Call of Cthulhu for the actual beasties that are inspired everything, and have a look through the abomination sections of the various monster manuals. You want to give them strange and horrible attacks. Acid and slime are good, and crushing is another good one, getting pulled apart. And it's a dark fantasy game. It's inspired by horror. You want to describe some of these things. You want to make these aliens scary. Here's a good trick, actually. You want to make them scary in not just disgusting ways. You want to make them have powers that people don't understand very well. I got a lot of mileage out of this in an old Call of Cthulhu game I ran. A character had experienced monsters as a kid, and now, an adult, she was invested in figuring out what she had experienced. So, okay, I say, file that away. Then they run into a time dog. They don't know what it is. First session, it comes out of nowhere, goes for the girl. Ah! Then they encounter it again. It's in a dark, haunted house, and she begins to feel that this is the same thing. Later on, they see the bad guy summoning the time dog up. Oh my god, she finally comes face to face with it, and yes, this is the thing that attacked her when she was a kid. Later on, she reads the book, and she finds out that it is a time dog and it can move through time. It had been attacking her as it sort of was jumping around in her timeline looking to get her. I thought it worked really quite effectively, and it was not a regular monster experience. You might want to give these monsters powers that player characters simply can't do. I generally don't like psychic powers in heroic fantasy, but maybe they will work for your creatures. Maybe you could use some older style of magic from earlier editions of D&D, like Incarnum. That was a strange thing. Or summoners and vestiges. Just things that players can't do that monsters can. Really works out quite well. D&D used to have something called the Cerulean Sigil, which was the Lovecraftian Elder Sign, which is a seal that you can use against these entities. Maybe put something like that into the game. It kind of became like a crucifix against vampires, but you can work around that if you want to. I think that's about it for monsters. Let's move on to bad NPCs. NPCs are even more important than regular. 3, 2, 1. NPCs are very important to dark fantasy games because you need to have innocence to protect. You need to have people who characters buy into looking after. And secondly, you don't have role-playing potential with hardly any of the cosmic monsters. If you want your characters to be talking to NPCs, you're going to have to make human NPCs, regular guys. You need to make them fairly sympathetic as well, because, as I said, PCs are going to be taking pretty horrific risks for these guys, so make them nice. You also want to keep in mind that sometimes there are just innocent victims in all this. A mad professor who reads the wrong book, a bard whose addiction to alien art has made nonsense of their minds and moralities, the druid who went to the wrong part of the forest at the wrong time. And part of the reason why you want to have innocence as an important part of cosmic horror games is because it is a horror game. Sometimes bad stuff happens to people with good intentions. Now, because you're rarely going to have a chance to deal with monsters in a role-playing light, and because the monsters that you do deal with are going to tend to be very, very powerful, cultists are important enemies in any Lovecraftian horror, because you can kill them, you can shoot them, and you can stab them, and you can talk to them. But you have to put a bit of a spin on them. And I think that, again, we need to look back to the past of D&D, because 3rd edition had some fantastic ideas for how to make bad NPCs. Prestige classes were archetypes, subclasses, whatever you want to call them. If you met certain criteria, you could become a prestige class. And a lot of these were designed specifically to be baddies. Cancer mages who made familiars from their tumours. Ooze masters who telepathically communed with black puddings and green slime. They even replaced their body parts with it. Vermin lords who became masters of fleas and rats, their bodies becoming hives. Deep thralls who served aboleths and krakens, illithid kin who slowly but surely mutated themselves into abominations. There were loads of inspirations. Prestige classes and lists of them are very, very easy to find. I highly recommend you have a look over them. If you are looking for a cult, give them the kinds of powers that are inspired by these horrific prestige classes. They are disgusting and they are great. I think we've run out of time to really discuss PCs a lot, but if you're making a PC for a dark fantasy game, you want to make them curious. They have to have a reason to be up against these creatures when normal people would just say, nah, outie. So you might want to have mad professors, you might want to have rogue scholars, you might want to have bards obsessed with alien music. You want to have your PCs be invested in encounters with the horrific supernatural for whatever reason to learn from them. Maybe your fighter had a run-in with something in a cave during a war. Maybe your wizard cast a spell and some terrible intelligence came from him. Maybe as a cleric or a paladin, you know that before the gods, the world was a darksome fortress of evil. Talk about it with your DM, because buying in is important for a dark fantasy campaign. You're going to be experiencing terrible things. A lot of the time, the simple motivations of gold and experience just aren't going to cut it. So talk with your DM. Make a character who's a little bit brainy. You don't have to have high intelligence. You just have to be intellectually engaged and who has a reason to fight. Okay, let's sum up. So in the end, dark fantasy is just regular fantasy, but the candles are on and you wear an eyeliner. Alright, it's pretty easy to do. It's just a mode of fantasy where you just emphasize certain darker aspects. You can't get true Lovecraftian cosmic horror in a game of D&D. It's not going to happen. Don't try. It's going to disappoint you. But you can create memorable, horrific horror fantasy. Make sure your players are okay with it. Not everyone's going to want to, sit through monsters eating fawns all the time. Give a lot of thought to your locations. This is a game that really does benefit from prep. Mood. Oh man, we didn't even get to talk about music. I'm so annoyed. Think about what you'll be doing in the adventure. So how you can make it creepy, where you can find spaces to be scary, to be gross, to be weird, to meet strange, feral, unsettling NPCs. So thanks very much for listening. When I started this series, bushfires were still raging all around, smoke, helicopters in the air, the heat was insane. So it was very, very good to come back and return to video making and to return to especially a topic I love. I know it's very, very long. I'm sorry. Thank you very, very much for your attention. Do actually hit the like button. It is very, very helpful to me. Tell your pals. I'll see you next time. Cthulhu Fatang.